Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, it's a bittersweet Sukkot holiday weekend as the coronavirus death toll rises dramatically. Israel and Lebanon begin landmark talks on a maritime border, and rabbis of old offer surprising insights on how to celebrate the holidays amidst a rising pandemic. Stay tuned for this year's new guide to Sukkot. Good news and bad news as Israel comes back from the opening Sukkot holiday weekend. Dozens of deaths making for a terrible spike, but while the overall infection rate drops. Israelis are enjoying a minor reprieve this week. Initial results from the start of lockdowns 2 weeks ago now apparently bearing fruit. The infection rate dropping slightly from a massive 15% average to between 9 and 11% on average, depending on the report. Still, since the weekend began, at least 17,200 new infections have been confirmed, bringing the total in Israel up to nearly 266,000. Over 70,000 actively sick, with 830 serious cases in the hospital wards, 223 of whom require ventilation. And the death toll, unlike the infection rate, is risen dramatically by over 100 to 1,682. Now, as for the hardest hit sectors, the ultra-Orthodox and Arab Israeli populations remain at the top with the highest rates of infection by far, especially with massive crowds for the holidays, crowded living conditions, and protests against closures and other coronavirus regulations. And this in spite of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and other cabinet ministers again holding special assessment meetings ahead of the holidays with the mayors of ultra-Orthodox population centers in Jerusalem, Bnei Brak, Modi'in Illit, and others. Netanyahu calling for strict adherence to the directives while saying that there'd be no easing of restrictions anytime soon. Similarly, in a Facebook Live post ahead of the holiday, the premier addressed the public to discuss plans to review the lockdown regulations this coming Monday.
הרי הסגר יש לו מטרה. המטרה היא לצמצם תחלואה. תחלואה היא תוצאה של תנועה ומגעים. אם התנועה והמגעים מאפשרים לנו צמצום של התחלואה וצמצום של התנועה, עשינו את עבודתנו. אז לא צריך שינוי. אם נראה שזה לא כך, אז כן צריך שינוי. זה נקבע לא באופן שרירותי ולא על ידי גחמות, זה נקבע על פי הנתונים. אנחנו נבחן את הנתונים ועד יום שני נוכל לקבל החלטה.
That said, members of every sector in the nation are feeling the hurt. Likud party member and Environmental Protection Minister Gila Gamliel being the latest MK to reveal that she has tested positive for COVID-19. Meanwhile, protests against coronavirus restrictions and the government itself erupted in small pockets of all sizes across the nation this weekend, and in direct confrontation to new legislation passed by the Knesset. Nittany Manson reports.
I'm here in a limited demonstration because we have one huge dictatorship. We have a Caesar who sees the flames of Israel and he doesn't care about anything. He doesn't care about more than 1 million people who are unemployment according to his behavior. He destroyed almost everything of our democracy, of our society. Because of him we are crying every night, and I'm here for my children and for my grandchildren, so help me God.
Tens of thousands of Israelis came out to protest this weekend, in spite of, and in some cases because of, the newly passed bill banning large demonstrations amidst the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. The controversial new law stating that travel beyond 1 kilometer from home and crowding beyond 20 people would no longer be tolerated for the purposes of protest. Tourism Minister Asaf Zamir of the Blue and White Party, meanwhile, announcing his resignation from government in protest against the new law and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. A challenge to be overcome, though, the months-long anti-government Black Flag demonstrations, simply now divided into smaller groups in response to this new bill, with some simply ignoring the new law altogether. And clashes between police and demonstrators ending with at least 38 arrested. But demonstrators are alleging police use of excessive force, with footage apparently proving their point. And Yesh Atid Knesset member Ofer Shela is now calling for a Knesset committee investigation into police conduct at the first opportunity.
And now with more on the enforcement of these ongoing closures, we're joined by Israeli police spokesperson, Superintendent Mickey Rosenfeld. Mickey, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Now, I want to start with the protests. How would you rate the police-protester interactions over the weekend?
Well, in general, the Israeli National Police were on scene in more than 60 different protests that took place across Tel Aviv. A lot of police activities were taking place also on the ground in order to take control of the situation and, number one, allow the protests to take place, but at the same time, police had to respond to incidents that took place when roads were blocked. And unfortunately, there were protesters that even attacked our police officers at the scene. There was a quick response, a rapid response, and we confirmed more than 38 people that were arrested. A lot of police preparations taking place also for future activities on the ground.
Well, so how do you respond to the numerous allegations of excessive force?
There was no excessive force used by our officers. The situation on the ground is that lots of people gathered at different points in different areas. Our units were on the ground patrolling in order to make sure that social distancing was being kept. Our officers as well gave out fines to people that were not wearing masks, but unfortunately, time and time again, the roads were blocked by individuals who blocked the area, and it was therefore necessary to make arrests at the scene in order to open up the roads across the Tel Aviv area. Also in Jerusalem, there were disturbances that also took place that we had to deal with, but in general, there were thousands of people. The majority of them kept laws and regulations, but where they were not kept, our units responded immediately and relatively swiftly, making arrests.
All right, now, a big issue is the controversial Knesset law, which was just passed last week, banning large protests with the exception of the one in Jerusalem of groups above 20 people. You know, and there have been a lot of discussions and arguments about the legality or the violation of human rights with respect to that law. At what point can an officer say, you know what, I'm not going to comply with this order, I'm not going to enforce this law, or I'm not going to do whatever I've been told to do? Is that allowed? Is that something that ever happens?
That doesn't take place within the Israeli National Police. Every officer has to implement the new rules and regulations of the Israeli government. Of course, there are those specific changes are happening all the time. Recently, over the last week, for example, people could walk around within 1 kilometer. As of now, only someone can come and demonstrate if they're within 1 kilometer of, for example, Jerusalem and the Balfour area, and that is perfectly acceptable. And our units are there in order to make sure that those that are taking part in the protests are safe, and we ensure their safety. But at the same time, any officer, of course, that sees something that takes place against the law is allowed to implement those rules and must implement those rules.
All right, now what are the plans for the coming week and weekend? You know, what lessons have you learned from this past week's Sukkot closure for the next?
Well, I think the most important issue for the Israeli National Police is keeping public safety and health measures at all times in all areas across the country. That is what we're dealing with at the moment in order to get the numbers of COVID-19 down. Let's not forget that the numbers are incredibly high. It's a joint effort by the public, by the Israeli National Police. Of course, people want to come and protest. That's perfectly acceptable. Our main efforts are roadblocks that have been set up across the country. Our police units patrolling on foot in the different areas to see exactly where people are, how they've arrived in their areas, and what for. When people need to go to hospitals and necessities, they are doing so, and we're making sure that we're allowing that to take place. But our main efforts over the next few days during Sukkot and the festival is inside the ultra-religious Jewish communities, preventing mass gatherings and the spread of COVID-19, as well as in the Israeli Arab neighborhoods to continue patrolling and prevent people from getting together.
All right, Mickey Rosenfeld, happy holidays, and thank you so much for being with us. Now, going back a moment, let's look at the right to protest in and of itself. Where do you draw the line when it comes to public health? And what are the responsibilities of the government versus the public? Joining us with answers is columnist for Newsweek and editor of HistoryCentral.com, Mark Schulman. Mark, it's been a long time. How are you?
Doing fine, considering everything that's going on in this country at the moment.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. So Mark, first impression, should the protests be illegal as they were made?
No, they should not be taking place, but they should not be illegal. And that's always been my view. I've said more than once and twice in the last couple of weeks that they should stop protesting just as a dugma ishit, example to everybody else of how you should behave, because I think it's a bad example because we're in a national crisis. situation with Corona is very, very dangerous. And I thought they should be calling off the demonstrations because it just doesn't look good. As they would say in Yiddish, pashnish. It just doesn't look good to have all these demonstrations taking place. On the other hand, I think it's very problematic when the government starts making the demonstrations illegal. We're the only country in the world, democratic country, I take that back, in the world that have limited demonstrations during a period of Corona. So I think it's sort of, it goes one way and it goes the other. And by limiting the demonstrations, they've actually brought out more demonstrators because people are really, go ahead.
No, so this kind of brings me to my next question. What is the solution then? Because coulda, woulda, shoulda. You can explain to the protesters that they should have the right, but they shouldn't use it. Well, they are using it. So, what is your solution to this?
Look, our problem is we have a leadership in this country that no one believes in. That's the underlying problem. 48%, 52%, you can argue the percentages, believe that everything the government or the prime minister says is a lie. And the other percentage believes the other half. We're split down the middle. It's very problematic in a time of national crisis. One of the number one things they say about fighting an epidemic is you have to have leadership that people believe in. You have to be straightforward. You have to tell the truth. And people have to believe in what's going on. Now, the problem in this country has been over the last 6 months is we've zigzagged so much that no one believes anything. The pressure group says this, okay, we're going to open up all the gyms. Another pressure group says this, oh, okay, we can fly, or we can go to hotels and fill up the hotels. So we let all these things happen. And now the only thing left was protesting in terms of what was being allowed. And so the government said, okay, on one hand, how can we possibly limit prayers if we don't limit protesting? Of course, prayers we're talking about is indoors and not outdoors, but it looks bad. How can we possibly do that? So they said, okay, the only way we can do that is possibly by limiting protests, which was very problematic.
All right, I'm not going to argue with you on the timeline of how we got to where we are, because that's a matter of record. But, hindsight is a bit 20/20. Isn't it easy to look back and criticize the government's actions against a pandemic that we really, even until today, didn't know that much about?
No, it's not easy. It's not hard. I've been doing it, if you can remember, since June, saying what the government was doing was insane. Opening the schools, letting the yeshivot open was the most insane thing that a government could possibly do at the level of corona that we had in this country at the time was crazy. And it's proven right, and it's proven wrong, so to speak. Look what happened. The minute we opened up the yeshivot and then opened the regular schools, the rate of infection doubled basically in this country. So no, all those things were clear. I mean, going back to May, April, then we didn't know a lot of things, but we certainly knew a lot by June and July, and we didn't follow through because we were afraid. The government was afraid of this, the government was afraid of that, too much pressure here, too much pressure there. So that's where we are. Now, what we needed to be done now in terms of the protest, there needed to be a sort of outreach to some of the people on the left, the quiet outreach that was necessary to be done, to try to reach out and try to see what could be done, what could be convinced. Maybe something could be done in terms of Netanyahu could say something about limiting his term. I don't know, anything that would make people a little bit happier in terms of that, to accepting the fact that this is a national crisis. In a national crisis, we all have to make sacrifices, and including protesting. We shouldn't protest in large numbers during a national crisis to the extent that it is. The media is also very responsible in this country. The media that kept on showing pictures of hotels and how can we get the best deals and how can we get the Yavan, the Greece, on top of which we very rarely show in the media stories of people who've died. They're sort of dying namelessly, facelessly. We don't seem to be following at all the fact that people are dying every single day. We don't show lines at funerals, anything, nothing at all. It's like these people don't exist. So if people don't exist, it can't be all that dangerous. Wow, so it's necessary as an overall national policy of hasbara, of explanation, of propaganda, however you want to do, national information, to explain to the population how terrible the situation really is, and to draw upon the better sides of everybody to act accordingly. We haven't succeeded in that. We seem to excite the Arab sector.
Mark, thank you so much. I appreciate you coming in and sharing your insights with us. Thank you so much. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.
Moving on, the whole world is now joining in the chorus of well-wishers for the American First family after President Donald Trump and First Lady Melania reportedly took ill with coronavirus.
I think it's a wonderful thing. I think it's really important that we keep all of our sick in mind, and President Trump, I hope he has a speedy recovery.
אני מאחלת לדונלד טראמפ ולמלניה טראמפ שיהיו בריאים ושכולנו נחזור בחזרה לשגרה.
Global leaders, including, of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu, also all sharing their thoughts and prayers as the president makes his way out of the woods with, quote, cautious optimism, according to his physician. Even Palestinian Authority President Abbas, who cut ties between the PA and the U.S. over Trump's regional policies, is sending hope for a speedy recovery. But meanwhile, the race is on to trace where and when the president first caught the disease, especially as the news comes just 2 weeks after hundreds of heads of state and diplomats arrived at the White House for the signing of the historic Abraham Peace Accords, including, of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu and his family. And moving back now to the Middle East, it's been 30 years since Israel and Lebanon publicly held direct talks. But Israeli Energy Minister Yuval Steinitz is confirming that United States-mediated negotiations are now underway in efforts to settle the Mediterranean maritime border dispute. And this is seriously significant progress, with both countries still technically at war, yet positioning themselves to benefit economically from their shared natural resources in the region. Hannah Rifkin with more.
30 years. 30 years of ongoing hostility and diplomatic silence between Israel and neighboring Lebanon. The two countries constantly on edge, too, with a disputed border leaving unresolved tensions and a technical state of war. But now may have come the time to resolve differences. Amidst U.S. brokered talks in expanding the landmark Abraham Accords, the U.S. Trump administration's next goal appearing to be brokering a deal between Israel and Lebanon for the greater good of the region, or at least economically. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announcing that the talks are a, quote, vital step forward, and that they, quote, serve the interests of Lebanon and Israel, of the region, and of the United States. This, as a Secretary of State, is also expecting to mediate high-level talks on the Blue Line, or the Israel-Lebanon land border, later. In fact, Pompeo even mentioned that both parties requested U.S. presence and involvement during the talks specifically, and that they are the result of almost 3 years of, quote, intense diplomatic engagement. The Office of the UN Special Coordinator for Lebanon, known as UNSCOL, getting set to host the event after the holiday of Sukkot. But at any rate, between Israel and Lebanon, gas reservoirs exist that could change the game for all. Yet, due to the dispute, neither country has been able to fully explore the area. The change in facts on the ground, then, coming after the August port explosion in Beirut, which killed hundreds, injured thousands, and left hundreds of thousands displaced. Lebanon's resulting economic peril, seemingly the driving factor behind the new willingness to compromise, especially in the gas industry. But maybe the biggest advantage to this new deal comes in the form of newfound security, as an agreement between Israel and Lebanon would eliminate Iranian terror proxy Hezbollah's argument to keep its weapons stored.
In other news, here's a surprise for anyone that's ever been to Tel Aviv. Not. Tel Aviv is expensive. But how expensive, you ask? Well, according to a report released by Swiss banking and investment firm UBS, the city's real estate prices exceed their actual value. Or in layman's terms, they're crazy overpriced. And the report issued by the company's global wealth management department also analyzed 25 other cities around the world. But the firm says that despite seeing a sharp increase in housing prices compared to the rest of the world, Israel's financial hub is not in any immediate danger. And amid the COVID-19 pandemic, it's likely that prices will actually even begin to decline accordingly. In fact, second quarter residential real estate deals are already down a whopping 41% from this time last year. And now for our final topic tonight, the ultra-Orthodox sectors in Israel continue to top the charts with higher than average coronavirus infection rates. And this is apparently largely a function of the disconnect between the Haredi public and the government. But this disconnect wasn't always so. Jewish media pointing to the 19th century Rabbi Akiva Eger, who advocated alongside the local authorities of his time for high holiday social distancing, abbreviated services, and other adopted practices in efforts to fight the spread of cholera. His efforts hailed for arguably saving thousands. So what can we learn from Rabbi Eger as we continue now to observe the holiday of Sukkot? Joining us with more is Rabbi Ariel Constantine, the founding rabbi at the Tel Aviv International Synagogue. Happy holidays, Rabbi. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Aaron.
All right, so first of all, how was your Sukkot weekend?
Thank God, beautiful weekend, quiet and unusual because we were home and not at the synagogue, but we've decided that we must close the synagogue and keep the people's health. something that is of paramount importance. Coming to the synagogue is an important value, but keeping the health is even more important. And citing the precedent that you mentioned, this is the precedent that we must follow.
So, all right. So before we continue on that road, how are we supposed to be observing Sukkot?
So Sukkot is a very family holiday. You go into the sukkah, you often invite guests into the sukkah, which is something that is a beautiful tradition, which unfortunately is limited this year.
Temporary dwelling that we build, yeah.
Right, it's a temporary hut with special rules that we build out in the garden. And we also take 4 species, a palm branch, an etrog, which is a citron, myrtle, and a willow, and we shake them in various directions. And that has many symbolisms about the land of Israel, about accepting all kinds of Jews, whether they are educated or they are not, whether they are doing good deeds or not. Everybody is united as one, and therefore it's a holiday of bringing people together. It's also a very universal message holiday that in the temple times we used to bring a sacrifice on behalf of all nations of the world, inviting them to the temple and praying on their behalf. And we pray for peace of all mankind and not just of the Jewish nation. So it has a very universal unity appeal, this particular holiday.
All right, well, speaking of sacrifice, you started to mention this again. What changes have we made in the religious community in the face of the pandemic?
It's forced us to make very challenging changes and sacrifices, as you mentioned. I mean, not being able to pray in the synagogue, especially on a holiday like Sukkot, where there are special rules where we march around the synagogue with those 4 species. Simchat Torah coming out when we dance with the Torah, singing and spilling all over into the street. These are very celebratory festivals. These are very communal festivals. It's a very challenging situation, very hard pill to swallow to not be able to do that en masse. But again, this is the requirement of the time. Judaism will survive as it always has throughout the generations. There have been many, unfortunately, pandemics through the world, and rabbis have responded very clearly. Health comes first. One of these citations of Rabbi Akiva Eger in the cholera epidemic was, they'll do a lottery. Half will come for Rosh Hashanah and half will come for Yom Kippur to keep the synagogue half full. And could you imagine them telling you, don't come to synagogue for Yom Kippur? That's exactly what the rabbis of old were telling us. And for whatever reason, the rabbis today many rabbis, not all, many rabbis are not receiving that message. And I hope they will. This is our tradition.
So that actually, I wanted to ask about that tradition. What can you tell us about the idea of v'chai bahem, or the Jewish law that demands vitality, and how it applies to today?
Right, Judaism always requires life comes first, especially when you talk about a rabbinic commandment like prayer, communal prayer, as opposed to the biblical commandment of life. Judaism is a life religion, believes in this world and encouraging life-sustaining activities. Anything that endangers life is put aside. If Shabbat observance, and you have someone who is ill, you must violate the Shabbat. You must violate Shabbat in order to save that life and to protect, the living beings. And this is something that runs across all laws in Jewish tradition. And therefore, this is the challenge of the hour. We must consider life first.
All right, well, I think that's a really beautiful message. I surely hope, as you said, that all the religious leaders worldwide will be adopting that sort of ideology, that life always comes first. Rabbi, thank you so much for being with us again.
Thank you, and I want to wish you and the whole world that you should have a new year filled with health, with happiness, and God willing, this pandemic should end as quickly as possibly be.
Thank you so much, and back to you as well. All right, now let's take a look at the weather forecast. Cooler temperatures finally moving in. The low tonight set to be around 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19 degrees Celsius. Then tomorrow you can expect clear and sunny skies and a comfortable high temperature of 86 Fahrenheit or 30 degrees Celsius. And before we go, of course, let's take a look at what's going viral in Israel. Oh, stop hitting that kid. You made him cry. Oh, wow, you really made him cry. Oh, wow. Love the slow-mo Super Saiyan transformation. That's amazing for all you nerds out there who appreciate that like me. That is it for today's news, though. Today's exchange rate is 3.43 shekels to the American dollar and 2.58 shekels to the Canadian dollar. For more news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube and Roku TV pages. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you so much for watching.